Welcome everyone. Thanks so much for coming today. We've had loads of interest in this webinar, slightly overwhelmed by the amount of interest, to be honest. So we are currently running through 2 platforms because we sold out of our webinar license within about 24 hours. So some of you guys will be watching via YouTube and some of you guys will be watching via Zoom. Doesn't matter which platform that you're watching us on, you can submit your questions to our panel through each one. So if you're on YouTube, you should see a box to your right that says live chat. Just type your questions in there and we'll pick them up. If you're on Zoom, then you should see a question and answer box also on the right. If you don't, then hover around on the bottom of your screen. You should see a thing that says Q&A. That will bring up your question and answer box. And then just submit your questions there and we'll also pick them up. And if you have any kind of technical problems, sound, etc., then don't worry too much because we are recording this and we will send you a recording after the event. So with that, I'll hand over to James. James will just give you a quick run through about some of the things we're going to discuss today.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is James Dyke and I'm an Assistant Director of the Global Systems Institute here at the University of Exeter. And we have curated a tremendous panel of the great and the good who want to help us answer some of the questions of, are we going to be able to build back better from the COVID crisis? And before we begin, it would be worth reminding ourselves just how tremendous the rate of change has been. I mean, what began initially as a small outbreak of a novel virus in a region of China has, over the past 6 months, completely transformed our globalized, industrialized civilization. And what we want to talk about today is what happens when we begin to power that civilization back on. Can we use this as an opportunity, a small window in which to act on some of the important injustices and inequalities that our current civilization and our different countries face? And to put that into some kind of context, one argument against radical action on the climate was always that we just can't simply turn off our fossil fuel economies, but that's exactly what we have done. And already we see attempts now by governments across the world to restart their economies by relaxing lockdowns and stimulating economic growth. What we do over the next 6 months to next few years could radically determine whether or not we're going to avoid dangerous climate change, as well as address the many other environmental and social issues that we face. So that's why we're here. We're very much looking forward to your questions, and I will hand over to the rest of the panel to introduce themselves.
Alice, do you want to kick us off?
Yes, my name is Alice Benn. I'm a lecturer in law at Exeter Law School, specialising in international environmental law and human rights. My research focuses on climate law and policy, so I spend a lot of time looking at the Paris Agreement, looking at how we respond to climate change in a just way, and how we embed justice into climate governance.
Excellent. And Robin?
I'm Robin, I'm the CEO of Coach Bright. I'm the non-academic on the panel, so I feel high sense of imposter syndrome for I actually graduated from the University of Exeter in 2012 in the heady days of the London Summer Olympics, which seem very far away now. Coach Bright, which is the organisation that I set up, we're a social mobility organisation, which is first and foremost about helping every young person from a disadvantaged background to become more independent, more resilient, so they can ultimately go to a place like Exeter University or a high-level apprenticeship. The way we do that is we train university students as amazing one-to-one tutors and coaches, but at its heart, we're a social mobility organisation which wants to ensure that that disadvantage gap, ultimately doesn't become a gap.
Brilliant, thank you. And Julia, move round.
So my name is Julia Steinberger. I'm a professor at the University of Leeds School of Earth and Environment at the Sustainability Research Institute. I'm also an IPCC lead author, and although I don't speak on behalf of the IPCC, nobody does. It's always good to say these things. And my research focuses on the resource requirements of well-being. So what do we actually need to live well as opposed to grow our economies? And the other thing is I consider how to restructure our economies in such a way that they would allow us to be less damaging and more focused on the things that matter.
Brilliant, thank you. Steffen?
Yeah, hi there everyone. Steffen Boehm, Professor in Organization and Sustainability at the University of Exeter Business School. I'm based at Penryn campus in Cornwall. My research concerns the role of business in society in general, looking at a lot of corporate governance issues, running quite a big module at Exeter, looking at the relationship between business and climate change. And I've done quite a bit of work on carbon markets and carbon trading, and looking at the shortcomings, particularly of these approaches to dealing with climate change.
Perfect, thank you. And Megan?
Hi, I'm Megan Streb. So I'm a partnership manager with Sustrans. Sustrans is a charity trying to making it easier for more people to walk and cycle as every day. So I do more influencing and strategy. I'm focused mostly on the South Hampshire area, and currently I'm working with local authorities on transport measures in response to COVID-19. I'm also doing a lot on the impact that it might have on high streets, placemaking, healthier neighborhoods, and safe spaces outside the school gate.
Brilliant, thank you. And you've heard from James. But James, do you want to share a little about who you are?
I'm interested in how humans affect the Earth system and what that means for the well-being of humans and some of the other species that we share the biosphere with now, and maybe even over geological timescales. So I do a bit of everything.
Okay, cool. Right, now I have some questions here to kick off that have been sent in, and some that I've brought up. So just start off with quite a general one. During lockdown, obviously, the way people live their lives has changed quite a lot, particularly when it comes to travel and ways of working. Do you think that any of these behaviours that have been forced on us might carry on when we go back to normal? I don't know who wants to kick us off with that one. Go on, James.
Well, I was looking at Megan.
Oh, okay.
James, on Zoom, when you try to look at someone, you're kind of looking at everybody. So in terms of travel, I think we are definitely seeing changes. I mean, there's even the AA have published research suggesting that people are going to be driving less and the impact that might have, and actually seeing that as a positive. You know, AA members generally don't like getting stuck in traffic. They just happen to be part of the traffic. So I think there's been some really welcome reports that have come from the government in terms of decarbonizing transport. There has been funding that's been made available for emergency measures. It's nowhere near enough. There's a heck of a lot more to do. But I think people are changing their patterns. And certainly what I've heard from a business context is that there's still a lot of speculation going around, but just thinking about office use and how that might change, how people might move around the city centers differently. And for instance, how retail might have to respond to the fact that there's just fewer office workers around. I think all over the place, different industries are anticipating that change as well.
Brilliant. Anyone else want to?
I'd like to, I can see these positive changes. It's very clear people are cycling more and just generally traveling less, which is all good. I'm an active cyclist and very much supporting this agenda. However, let's not underestimate the rebound effect that is, I feel, already happening. People are quite scared to get on public transport, and that's actually official government advice. So I actually think that we will travel more by car because a lot of people will be scared to go on public transport because of the virus situation. And people just nip down to Cornwall for day trips from wherever they are, just because, you know, so I think there's a sort of a rebound effect, which will be quite significant, I think. So let's not kid ourselves that suddenly, you know, the green future has already arrived. I don't think that's going to happen.
That's cool. I mean, we've had a question that follows on from that already from Ken. How do you successfully influence the public away from cars in more rural locations that are not served by public transport? And has anyone got any suggestions for that? Proposals to make space for pedestrians and cycles, for example, we said.
quite good practical knowledge on this. I think I would just like to reinforce what Steffen said, which is that we can't, I think one of the things we should stop doing, first of all, is start talking about these changes as though it's either the public driving them or they're just happening out in the world. And one of the things that COVID has taught us is that government has an influence and that we have an influence in how we can choose to direct certain trends, that we can actually deliberate and do things in different ways than just allowing things to happen. So I think there is, for instance, evidence from Germany that shows that a lot of people intend to buy cars, in some cases for the first time post-COVID, because they are afraid of public transportation. And I think that that's one of the things that's that the government and we collectively need to step in and say, this is not the way forward. If we care about health, we need to care about pollution and we need to care about road safety. And I think in rural areas, road safety is really important. There's a lot of opposition to cyclists. Cycling is politicized in ways that need to be highlighted because there's a media portrayal of cyclists as dangerous parasites on the roads in some cases. I mean, really sort of, and direct links between people reading certain types of media and then attacking cyclists or being dangerous to them in rural areas, which is, I think, something we really need to talk about and sort of make the roads and our public transportation space now includes roads. They're not just for cars anymore. That's our public transportation as well for active travel. And they should be safe for electric cyclists. They should be safe for normal cyclists. They should be safe for everybody. And that includes issues around air pollution, issues around road safety. So I think road safety is really critical in rural areas. And there's a huge job of communication that goes with making cycling safe and accepted in those areas. So it's not just going to happen one way or the other. It will happen the way we make it happen. We can make it happen very differently.
That's great. I mean, I've got another question here, which is, I mean, how much do you think, change needs to be led by government and policy, and how much do you think is actually led by grassroots, by communities, by people just making changes in their lives? Go, James.
Like I'm in school. So it has to be both, right? So we're talking about polycentric governance. We can't wait for government to take action, and it's unrealistic and implausible to assume that grassroots community-led action is going to be sufficient. We need it all, right? But that doesn't mean that structural change isn't needed, because if you think about what do communities need, they need to be empowered in order to make the change. Certainly in the United Kingdom, we do have an incredibly centralized form of governance. And that goes beyond, a decade of austerity and the continued defunding of local councils. In the way in which we elect people to represent us and the methods and systems of representation are increasingly, or have been historically increasingly concentrated in, Westminster. Some of the work that Megan has already talked about, it's going to be absolutely crucial, and it's fast and it's agile, and it must have that space in which to be able to flourish. So there needs to be kind of structural changes to how we even govern ourselves in the UK, and I'm sure in other nations as well.
Yeah, just to follow on from that, I think that we absolutely need grassroots civil society movements to push policy. And we're seeing, especially in the climate field, but also increasingly now with respect to social equality, and the emphasis that recent protest movements have put on these kinds of issues, and they have forced change by policymakers. We've seen the net zero emissions target coming in, the government declaration of a climate emergency in response to some of these grassroots movements. But we also need, as has already been stated, we need structural change. We need the government to put in place policies that are going to incentivize more sustainable action. So we need not just more sustainable transport, but more sustainable homes, more sustainable work models. I think a lot of the points that we've been discussing already about transport and things that we've learned from this new remote way of working that's sort of been forced upon us could really inform policy approaches to the climate emergency moving forwards. If we can make sure that remote working is accessible to everyone, and we can encourage employers to make that available in the future, then that could be a really positive thing that could come from this.
Brilliant, thank you.
I just wanted to back up what Alice said there, really, which is, I think if COVID has taught us anything, is government can can make bold, ambitious changes. I remember when, I think it was a Friday afternoon when Rishi Sunak announced the furlough scheme, how that kind of gave you a sense of the scale and depth of what government could do almost overnight. However, I think as we've seen in education, there's been a real sense of school leaders being dictated to by government what is happening with school reopening, what is happening in terms of home learning, remote learning, without a real understanding of what's happening on the front line and on the ground. So incredible head teachers doing incredible work in their own individual schools and regions. And for me, there has to be that connection between grassroots movement of people on the front line who really understand the day-to-day work of their issue, which kind of links in with central government, which to me feels that there's still that disconnect that exists at the moment.
Brilliant, thank you. And we've got a couple of other questions about policy that I'll come on to. But there's one here that's slightly connected here for you, Robin, regarding safe spaces and outside school gates, and also for Megan. And if there's anything around contingencies for COVID that have arisen that suggest education will or should extend beyond the school gates, changing time and space and use of technology in school. And I know you've been involved in some tutoring programs. So I don't know if you want to mention that.
Yeah, so I guess obviously the big announcement was on last Friday. Gavin Williamson spoke about the creation of a national tutoring program. I think £350 million being formed on that, which we were an early advocate and lobbyist for. And I think that brings an interesting discussion in education about how much do you involve external parties and external players. A lot of our work has happened in parts of the Southwest where travel's come up in this conversation, where our kind of face-to-face tutoring model is very challenging in parts of North Devon, for example, which take kind of 2 hours on public transport to reach. And I think in relation to that question of how do we create more spaces or safe spaces, it's really a question of haves and have-nots and inequality. So at the moment, I think there are 1.9 million households without access to basic internet. And I think that digital divide has really been seen in school, that there are certain households where we can do some fantastic virtual tutoring, one-to-one work with a disadvantaged pupil. Unfortunately, in some households, that's not possible. They might not have a device, they might not have adequate bandwidth to access that provision. And I think there's a real technology issue here before we even get onto what do you do, how do you create that, actually, how do you give people the right tools to even begin accessing stuff. So I don't know whether other people have thoughts about that kind of technology-based issue.
Do you have anything to add to that?
I guess I would say that we're, yeah, sorry.
Oh, no, carry on, Julia.
I guess I would just like to reinforce that point that we really see that divide carrying through. So for instance, at the university level, I've had students who basically I had students who went back home across the world to India, to Japan, and were fine. And even in quarantine doing their module work and in a hotel room somewhere and still were okay. And then there were some students in the UK who just fell off the map. Like, I didn't hear from them. I had no idea what was going on. They didn't answer email, and it turned out they didn't have email where they were. They just had nothing. And they weren't able to continue their schoolwork. So we see that. I also saw that at the IPCC. We had to do our first meeting online. Yes, I was so happy. Thank God, not traveling all over the world to complain about climate change. Anyway, and it worked fantastic. It worked really well for those who were there. And again, not everybody was there. And the people who weren't there were from areas around the world that just didn't have the infrastructure. And then infrastructure is not expensive compared to other stuff like travel. It's actually something that we should be paying a lot more attention to.
Okay, brilliant. I'm just going to change topic ever so slightly because we've had a couple of questions around net zero and CO2 levels. And we've had a question here that's regarding how is the UK compared to other countries, in terms of its emissions level and its approach to climate change. Does anyone have any insights on that?
You want the polite answer?
The real answer, James.
Well, the fact that the UK is internationally leading should tell us how urgent and dire this situation is right now, because the UK is nowhere near decarbonising fast enough that it needs to. And that's before we even think about negative emissions. So the way I explain negative emissions technologies, the whole suite of ways in which we think we're going to suck carbon out of the atmosphere in enormous quantities starting around the middle of this century, is that it's kind of a suite of approaches and technologies that have been invented because we haven't taken the required mitigation steps. So we know for 30, 40, 50 years that we need to reduce the total amount of carbon we put into the atmosphere, and we haven't. And each year when we delay, we increase the total amount of carbon that we're going to need to suck out at some kind of fictional future. So the fact that most people have never heard of BECCS, bioenergy carbon capture, storage and sequestration, is a scandal, because if BECCS doesn't work, we're on a collision course with dangerous climate change. So BECCS is baked into all of the nation's attempts to limit warming to no more than 2 degrees Celsius. But when you dig into the details of what's going on in these emission scenarios, they paint an incredibly optimistic picture of our ability to remove significant amounts of carbon. And if it doesn't work, we're in trouble. So really, it's a form of moral hazard. I mean, arguably, these negative emissions technologies have been invented in order to justify inaction now. And if that is the case, then it's a complete and absolute scandal, right? Because if you take them away, you realize that the rate of change that we need to see is comparable to the rate of change that we've seen emissions reduce in 2020, because of basically we've stopped our globalized industrialized civilization, which is still largely powered by fossil fuels. So there's an awful lot that we need to talk about, and we need to do it in a way which doesn't make people despair and depressed and switch off and just give up. You know, we can do it, we can decarbonize, we can limit our impacts and our actions, but the fact that the UK is held up as some kind of role model country sometimes by some people certainly deserves a little bit of unpicking.
Could I add to that?
Of course.
Yeah, totally agree with you there, James. Just another dimension to that. You know, a lot of national statistics around carbon emissions, etc., are really production-led statistics rather than consumption-led statistics. So one reason why the UK is sometimes hailed as some sort of leader in climate change policy, as well as actually reducing emissions, is that, you know, essentially the UK economy has been more or less deindustrialized over the last 30 years, and we've exported these industries to places like China and other places where a lot of the dirty industry has moved to, but we're still consuming the products produced in those countries. So the global supply chains that we're accustomed to, whenever we click buy on Amazon, that's most certainly that product is gonna come from countries like Turkey, India, China, etc., whose emissions have absolutely mushroomed over the last 20 years, expanding massively. So I'm not a big fan of any kind of nation comparison kind of tables, because they're mostly very misleading. You know, we need to really look at the global picture, but also look at global supply chains and look at what people actually consume in the countries. And if we do that, then we will actually see that the UK is not a great leader at all. So there's a lot to do.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. And just to pick up on this point, I think the UK is heralded as a leader, and I think part of that is because we do have some of the most ambitious climate law in place. If we look at the Climate Change Act, we have a net zero emissions target by 2050, which is legally binding, which in many countries is not the case. But, and it's a big but, the policy ambition doesn't match that target. So the Committee on Climate Change, which is the government's own committee that provides advice to the government on how to meet what we have is periodic carbon budgets. We're on track for the current carbon budget, but not for either of the two subsequent carbon budgets. And a lot of the emissions reductions measures that we've seen have been very concentrated in the energy sector. But what we need is really broad-based policy action across the board through transport, housing, work models, you name it, agriculture, food, all of these different policy sectors in order to meet these really ambitious targets. And as of last year, the Committee on Climate Change was saying that actually the ambition and implementation falls well short of where we need to be to meet those budgets. And this was before COVID, of course. So now I think we face the risk of having all of our policy focused on economic recovery at the expense of the climate emergency. So I think what is really crucial at the moment is that we embed sustainability targets, climate emergency targets, emissions reductions requirements into the way that we respond to COVID. And it needs to be broad-based. It needs to be across all law and policy sectors and not just targeted on energy.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I've actually got a question here where Chris has said, you know, we've got a global target. Obviously, like you guys have mentioned, of 2 degrees, which, whether it's simplistic or imperfect, the fact that there's a target gives everyone a discussion. Do you think that there should be a defined target in terms of post-COVID recovery so that we actually set ourselves a goal? And if so, you know, what should that be? And should it be UK based or global? There's a lot of questions in that one. Don't know who wants to give that a go first.
I can go. Well, first of all, the global agreement exists in the form of the Paris Agreement. It's not binding and it's not stringent enough, but it does have legal force within each country, even though it's not something where countries internationally can impose sanctions on each other for not abiding by it, for instance. And so it is legally binding as an international agreement within the UK, and that target is in fact 1.5 degrees. And so the Committee on Climate Change has been taking that seriously and has been devising net zero targets that are at least on paper compatible with a global 1.5 degree target. And I think that that's really important to maintain and to keep an eye on. I think that the point is to strengthen those targets, to make those binding. But I think we also have to realize what James said just a few minutes ago, that this is a massive transformation. And the IPCC is not messing around anymore. They're talking about urgent, radical transformations of our whole economies. You know, they're not talking about tweaks. And so it's not about building back towards economic recovery, it's building back towards survival. And I think one of the things we really have to start doing is putting back, and that's something that the IPCC's Twitter account said the other day, the Arctic is burning up, basically. Net zero is a question of survival. And it is very rare for them to use that kind of language. So I think that we really have to keep that front and center. This is a public health issue. Climate is a public health issue, just like COVID, worse than COVID, on a slightly longer time scale, but not that much longer, really. So in terms of those targets, we have to keep them front and center, and they are not purely climate targets. They have to touch every sector of the economy. We are talking about transforming industrial systems. And the way we consume, the way we produce, the way we live, the way we get around, the way we work, the way we learn, the way we teach, all of it. And I think that that's something where, in terms of what Alice was saying, there are lots of proposals. And the last economic crisis, everybody was saying, please don't make it as bad when you build back. Now you cannot turn around without getting knocked in the head with a proposal for how to build back better. And so I was part of several of them. There's one I really like, which is 10 Principles to Build Back Better that the Wellbeing Economic Alliance took up. And I think that those really show the kind of scope. One of the things is to strengthen current environmental measures and not slide back on others. Because I think one of the things that's been happening during COVID is that everybody else was told, oh, you don't have the budgets you need for education, for health, or whatever. But the fossil fuels companies went in there and got more subsidies. So we're also dealing with very overtly unfair and negative system in terms of the structures that are winning right now, and that will win in their recovery unless we realize what's happening and really push back against that and put healthy public health recovery or well-being recovery front and center.
What do you think, there's a question here, what do you think we can do as individuals in terms of trying to force change like that, holding governments to account? Go, Megan.
So several months ago, before all in-life meetings stopped happening, I got invited to a few different sessions that local authorities were leading on their climate emergency action plans, or however they were phrasing it. And the thing that I certainly walked away with was it was very clear that they didn't really understand what they were agreeing to at all. They knew that something needed to happen. They knew that they were concerned about it and that their constituents were concerned about it. And they thought, great, we'll put up some solar panels on our buildings and we'll change our vans to electric vans, and that'll do it, right? And there was just the disconnect between where they know they need to get to and how the heck you get there was just vast. And that was really difficult to realize that what they really need is a lot of support. They need a lot of support. They need a lot of training. They need a lot more resource in terms of people actually talking to them about, well, what might this look like for you and for your community? And I don't know that we need like a new fancy, a catchy number. I think what we really need is a lot of support on how you create an action plan that individual communities can work with, and that link into national targets as well.
Could I say something about that?
Of course.
I think that's true. I think the ambition is there, but there's very little roadmap that people can follow, and there are lots of trade-offs here, particularly now post COVID-19, where the environmental targets will be probably set against economic targets, etc. My experience down in Cornwall is that you have a lot of progressive people in the council and many other institutions, and they are starting to use quite radical tools. Some of you might be familiar with Kate Rabo's model of donut economics, which is basically looking at a new way of doing economics, looking at the social and environmental planetary boundaries, and then turning that into actual policy. And people are actually using that in the council as a discussion tool, and trying to come up with policies using that new quite radical framework. So people are rethinking radically, and everywhere. I'm just publishing a book on climate activism, and the key strapline for that is that activism for climate change and radical climate action is happening everywhere. Not just in the social movements, not just in Extinction Rebellion, but in the councils, in businesses, small and large, in community groups, even in universities. So it's happening everywhere. So the pressure is mounting, I think, and one way to, the key challenges of how you combine this pressure and how you actually affect real change at local level and governmental level. But pre-COVID-19, it was quite astonishing what, in terms of climate change action, actually has been achieved over the last 2 or 3 years. There's the Greta effect, there's the David Attenborough effect, there's the XR effect. There are all these parallel movements that were happening that have actually pressurized business and government interaction. So I think we were actually on quite a good path before COVID-19. The key question is whether we can come back to that. And one way of doing that is to say, well, if you think COVID-19 is big, then and of course it is, real impacts on people, but then think about climate change. So, there's some people who've been calling the COVID-19 as a mere dress rehearsal for the real challenge of the climate crisis. And I think that's maybe the way to go, to say, well, now we've had the dress rehearsal, now we need to do the real hard work and come up with a plan for the next 20 years, because we can't really wait till 2050.
Yeah, I just want to make a brief comment about the tremendous support and guidance and information and help that different organizations and councils and entities and bodies are going to need in order to be able to walk the talk on declaring climate emergencies. So last year I was involved in a number of declarations and different organizations, and one of the arguments for not doing it was the organizations don't really understand what they're letting themselves in for. If you actually were to make this declaration, then to follow that through is going to require pretty much in all instances quite radical action, and they didn't not know that. So we shouldn't propose this is what we should have these organizations do. And I was saying, no, that's exactly why you should be doing it, because they don't know what's required. They are going to make the declaration. If you actually spell out all the things they need to do, there's nowhere near getting their agreement. So it's not as if we tricked them, it's just we encouraged them and supported them to make the line in the sand. And now it's our job, it's our responsibility to do everything we can with those organizations to help them deliver on what are ridiculously ambitious targets. I mean, it really is transformative. But everyone's sold on that idea now. We've got such potential. As Steffen said, in some respects, if it's not now, it might be never. We do have this window, we do have this opportunity. We absolutely have to seize it. Both hands, all limbs, running in and making as much progress as we can.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm just going to change the subject a little bit again now, because we've had a couple of questions around inequality and the fact that climate change, it does impact vulnerable communities around the world, poorer communities more around the world, and also that COVID has been shown to impact poorer communities and BAME communities in different places. So how can we rebuild with continuing to prioritise work in this area and not expand the gap between rich and poor in different communities? I don't know if anyone wants to take that one on.
Can I jump in on that?
Yeah, go for it.
So I think it's really, really crucial that we put the needs of the most climate vulnerable communities and groups at the centre of our response, because we know that climate change has a really disproportionate impact on poorer communities, on minority communities, on communities who are often marginalised from decision-making processes because of structural inequality that already exists, and communities who often have reduced adaptive capacity to climate change impacts, things like floods, storms, droughts. And it is much more difficult for communities who are already marginalised, who already face issues around poverty or socioeconomic inequality to respond to those impacts. And we need our policymakers to recognise that and put that front and centre in the way that they respond to climate change. And I think it is starting to get further attention, particularly at the international level. We saw with the Paris Agreement, for the first time, there was an acknowledgement of human rights and the particular rights impacts that climate change is going to have on, for example, Indigenous communities, minority groups. But rights aren't really being embedded in government responses to climate change. It's still kind of posited as this environmental problem that we can put in this nice little silo. And that's just not the case. We need people to realise that it is a human rights challenge as well. It's going to affect particular groups of people, and it's going to affect our health, our lives, our livelihoods, and that of future generations as well. So I think it's really crucial that we have a rights-based approach to tackling climate change.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else have anything they'd like to contribute to that?
I guess just moving away from climate change, I think thinking about building back post-COVID, I think there's a real danger and challenge here that inequality only widens as a result of the virus. We know that disadvantaged communities are more likely to die potentially from COVID-19. We obviously know there's an intersection between ethnic minority groups and those from disadvantaged backgrounds as well. And just from an education context, I think it's no surprise that the current education system prioritizes those that are talented when it comes to sitting exams and a certain type of provision. I think there is an interesting opportunity here about, could we create an education system for pupils of all talents and actually look to increase the use of apprenticeships, look to kind of repurpose the apprenticeship levy that was obviously put in place to kind of support more learners post-school to get into employment. That's kind of been shimmied around to being used by employers in a slightly different context, I think almost as a kind of masters for their kind of professionals. So I think there's an interesting question here about post-COVID, could we redesign an education system that showcases the talents of everyone, not just those that are, you know, driven by kind of exam results and standards. And I think that in a lot of ways will create a more equitable system for those from marginalized communities at the moment.
Brilliant, thank you. And then there's another question here connected with the economy, saying, you know, forthcoming recession, need to tackle the enormous national debt. Is there a chance that will derail any incentives to make a more sustainable future in favour of short-term economic expediency? I don't know, Steffen, if you want to kick off on that one.
Well, we need to realize that we've already been in a deep economic crisis for quite a while, but it's been a very uneven crisis. You know, post the financial crisis, 2008-9, you know, we've had a lot of people benefiting from it. You know, the banks have actually, you know, recovered from it very quickly, by and large, and you know, lots of people you know, have been fine, but millions of people haven't, and you know, councils have been starved of funds through austerity. Many communities haven't received a lot of funding. So the economic crisis and the inequalities that we've just talked about and heard about have existed for quite a while, and not just since the financial crisis, but you know, over the last 20, 30, 40 years, we've seen inequalities rise. So the economic crisis, if we go beyond sort of, you know, the mere GDP numbers, you know, has existed for quite a while, because we haven't really delivered, you know, sustainable economic growth that everybody can access. So that, you know, that's been going on for a while, and of course the current COVID-19 crisis has exacerbated this crisis. So, you know, a lot of privileged workers and employees, you know, have been sitting at home baking bread and congratulating themselves of how you know, how they have slowed down and how they have lived a more sustainable lifestyle, while millions of people have lost their jobs, particularly those who've been disadvantaged already, who've been on 0-hour contracts. You know, just think of the millions of people who have been on 0-hour contracts who haven't had any income, and some of them have slipped through the government support net as well. And for that very reason, we have food banks who've seen more and more people coming their way. You know, some of, you know, our local food banks in Cornwall have doubled the numbers of people or families they're serving. So the inequalities are absolutely staggering, and that's not often portrayed properly in the media. So if we think about economic recovery, then we need to think about you know, the inequalities, and if we link that to climate change and my earlier point about the dress rehearsal, then, you know, we can see already that many climate policies have the potential for exacerbating inequalities. And so we can foresee a situation where large parts of the global population will be not very much directly affected by climate change, because they can switch on their aircon if it gets too hot, for example. But millions and millions of people will be directly affected, and they're already affected. Land-based communities, anybody who lives off the land, whether that's a subsistence farmer in India or rain herding communities in northern Scandinavia, they've been affected by climate change for decades already. And but these communities don't necessarily have the access to global media so that everybody knows about these things.
Thank you. Does anyone want to, Julia, do you want to add to that?
Yes, absolutely. So I agree with everything that Steffen said, and I think that building on what James and Robin were saying, maybe one of the things that we're incentivizing here is we're learning. We're learning as part of this dress rehearsal, and one of the things that we're learning, and that our governments or our communities have to learn, hopefully our local governments, I believe the national government is to some extent beyond hope, is about these inequalities and about the fact that racial discrimination intersects with vulnerability, intersects with air pollution exposure, intersects with stress and poor health provision, so that all of these things come together, and that these are often the results of an economy that is structurally unequal and that rewards structural inequality and has for decades. And that has had a sort of ideology of starving the public sphere and starving public capacity to respond, including our health systems. Our health systems were starved at the beginning of COVID and got hurt. Doctors and nurses died as a result of not having proper preparation. If they had listened to the experts, they knew a pandemic was coming. A pandemic is new to us as an experience. It's not new to anybody who ever thinks about public health. They knew that was coming down the line sometime. It's just that our governments refuse to plan for it. So the real parallels here with climate change. We know this thing is barreling down at us, and we see our governments not preparing for it. And I think that one of the things that we learn when we learn about a structurally unequal economy, we also need to learn about the fact that using the debt as a cudgel to argue for austerity is a political choice. And it was always a political choice. It was never, oh, the economy is this way, so we must do that. That was never, ever the case. So we have political choices here to do a completely different economy, and we must. So if we take the lessons of what we see in the world around us and where it comes from, and we understand how things are going to get even worse, building back better means, at the very basis, focusing on frontline communities, vulnerable communities, people who've suffered from racial disparity, disabled people and their ways of getting around, people who suffer from air pollution, asthma in cities around busy roads, school exits, all of that. So it really means putting those people front and center and building back in a completely different way. It means a real transformation of our economy, because it also means changing which industries we coddle. Not the airlines, not the automotive industry, but more localized recovery. And that can mean apprenticeship programs, it can mean good jobs, it can mean a lot of localized work. There are millions of good local jobs that can be created through this recovery. And this is a political choice. It's not that there's not enough money. There is enough money. The UK has plenty of billionaires, okay? We can live on them for a long time. So we can really move forward in a very different direction here, but it is a
Brilliant, thank you. I've got 10 minutes left. I can cram a few more questions in. So there's a question here. How do we ensure the natural world and biodiversity aren't sacrificed in the race to economic recovery? So it's a similar kind of question, but asking about the fundamental role of natural capital. Can that be used to support our existence? So James, you're grinning.
Yeah.
Want to give that one a go?
Just the term natural capital just assumes it's something that you pour into industrialized civilization and outspits, I don't know, like smartphones and cars. I mean, if we view the natural world as nothing more than a resource for our consumption, as a sink for our pollution, then obviously we're not going to value it. And we're most really going to shoot well beyond any kind of safe operating space for humanity, which is which imposes on us these kind of planetary boundaries. One of the problems I have with this idea of planetary boundaries and the developing science to understand, well, how much can we drive the Earth's climate until we undertake tipping points? How much can we reduce biodiversity before we may see unfolding domino type reactions, which we might see the collapse of entire ecosystems, even biomes, is that what science is really allowing us to do is get closer to those limits, because there is tremendous incentives to liquidate natural resources into, you know, pounds and dollars, right? That's how our civilization works. It's a kind of voracious organism which is consuming resources. And so the expression natural capital just kind of highlights our relationship with the Earth system, with the natural systems, which, you know, we're not disinterested observers about. You know, they are fundamental to the operation of the planet, the life support systems. And if they don't work, or if they work in significantly different ways, it's kind of game over for us. So we need to establish a new way of thinking about the Earth system and the way in which our economies run on it. So I would argue that's fundamental to what Build Back Better is. It's not just, I mean, we have to do all these things, you know, in the real world, but you also have to take something of a mind shift, where if we just build back towards viewing resources as just something that we can translate into money, we're just going to make exactly the same kind of mistakes. So there is this opportunity to understand just how dependent we are. I mean, this pandemic has come from, in some respects, the form of our globalized industrialization, because we are increasing ecosystem destruction, we're increasing the intensity of livestock production, we're increasing the probability that there will be these zoonotic diseases which will jump from wild animal populations into our livestock and into humans. It's kind of, it's part and parcel of how our civilization operates now. And we realized that was previously, most people, they wouldn't have really given that a second thought. Well, now, you know, we've undertaken lockdown for the best part of 6 months and plunged our global economy into emotionally a massive recession. So it matters. What we do to the natural world matters. Our relationship to it matters. And so, you know, this must be the core ideas as we actually do work to build back better.
Yeah, I really agree with that. And absolutely, I think we need to draw out the linkages between not just biodiversity loss and our health, but also biodiversity loss and the climate emergency, because the climate emergency is such a huge, wide-scale problem that is going to affect all of our lives, and it is inherently linked to the state of our biosphere, to forests, to ocean ecosystems. There's a lot of recognition in the climate literature already that we need to reforest, we need to create natural carbon sinks to help us meet our climate targets. And that has benefits both for enhancing biodiversity, helping halt or slow at least some of the losses of species that we're seeing at the global level, and also help us to bring down our emissions and slow some of the impacts that we're going to see on us as human beings. So I think we need to recognize that this is inherently interlinked. It's not just something that environmental organizations can tackle in isolation. It needs to be inherently built into our policy response to the climate emergency as well.
Brilliant, thank you. And I just want to go back to a question that was posed a bit earlier on, which was basically, what can universities do? Obviously, we are a university. Julia's from another university. Robin and Megan have been to university. You know, what can we do as institutions? That was the question, to try and change people's ways of doing things and try and change policy.
Other than divesting?
Okay. Go.
So other than divesting, which I think is a thing that large institutions can do, and anyone on this call who works for an institution of any size that offers you a pension, you have an opportunity to influence through your HR department. So other than that, I think that there's a lot that can be done, maybe in terms of offering some of that support that I mentioned earlier to local authorities to explain to organizations about kind of the making it clear, making it understandable what actual steps might need to be taken by them. I think a lot of times people might be put off from academia and kind of think, oh, well, that's, I'm too focused on the day-to-day, I don't have time for that. And so universities doing more to bridge that gap in order to bring that out to other institutions, I think would be really helpful. A lot of that happens already, but I think it's needed. So as much of that as possible would be great.
Brilliant. Anyone else?
I can say something. So at Exeter last year, we were successful to pressurize the university leadership to declare a climate emergency, climate and ecological emergency, I should say. And colleagues on this panel were part of that, and that's been a great success. We then had a working group to come up with a plan of what we actually do with that. And then we, very quickly realized that essentially we need to reinvent how a university works. I should say that the university has not shied away from actually turning this action plan that we've come up with into reality. And we have a great sustainability manager that tries to make sure that the university lives up to its own ethical commitments. So that's been great, but at the same time, lots of things are still missing. We still have, generally speaking, an incentive system in place that favors research funding and research publications over anything else. So this kind of interaction we're having now, we need to see much more. We need regional and national engagement with communities. We need to actually, as academics, we need to have time and incentives to engage with the local councils as well as with other stakeholders to bring about these changes. That's not always how the incentive and performance systems that academics have work out. As I said, we're incentivized to get external funding through the door and get great publications, which of course is needed, and that's how we drive knowledge forward. But to do the practical hands-on stuff is sometimes not enough emphasized. So we need to do that a lot more. But universities, we have lots of great experts, and the GSI and the other institutes at universities are full of great experts. I think what the COVID-19 has shown is that maybe government and the public more generally is happier again, as maybe previously, to listen to experts, and maybe experts do have something to contribute, and that's not necessarily always wasn't necessarily always the case in the past. And so maybe climate experts that we have a lot of at Exeter can enter the public debate and get invited to BBC and other channels talk rounds and get maybe heard more now than before.
Thank you.
Cool. I think Julia wants to say something, and
Of course, Julia, go for it.
Political choice. I just wanted to say, so I think Leeds is a bit similar in some ways. So there were some very good principles that were put forward on climate action from Leeds University. But there's a just transition within Leeds that needs to happen. Because, for instance, we have a program within my school of petroleum geoexploration. So we actually train the people who go and find the stuff to burn to cause planetary destruction. And so one of the things everybody's learning, we're learning about internal contradictions. We're learning that the university has a different role to play now, and that we need to play that role, and we need to become fierce advocates. Because yes, the government did things on COVID, but do you know how much screaming and shouting and work it took from epidemiologists and health professionals to get even the most basic stuff done? And that was with the imminent threat of the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives within the next couple of months. And the government still was trying not to do the right thing. So we need to be not just on the BBC, we need to be basically like shouting and screaming and bashing down doorways, because that's what it's going to take to get the response We've just seen that from a pandemic perspective. So I think that we're learning a lot. We're learning about changing our role, and we're learning about the necessity of becoming really insistent advocates. And I hope that everybody's taking that message to heart, because that's what it's going to take.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, there's these wider questions about universities. You know, what are universities for? What is the value of knowledge in our societies? But when it comes to COVID and the climate crisis, we can't sit this one out as a sector. We have to get engaged. And certainly that means going well beyond our traditional modes of engagement, which is, you know, yes, high impact papers, maybe being, you know, asked by the BBC to do an interview or something, which is great, right? But the level of engagement we need to see from universities, it has to be a step change. And that also goes in the teaching as well. I think in many examples, university education is not fit for purpose right now, because we need to be educating young people about how they can best navigate their way through what is going to be a very changeable and turbulent time. And we say we want to empower them to become agents of change, which is a very noble way of saying we want to give them some understanding of systems and how they fit into wider society, and how climate change is really about global inequality, and what are the different political, economic and philosophical thoughts that underpin all these things. So that's, I would argue, one of the things that universities should be doing. We try, I think we as an institution, as in a sector, need to do much, much harder. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. I'm conscious we are 2 minutes over. I just want to throw up one final question that's come up a couple of times over on YouTube, which was to do with anti-racism. So slightly different angle here, but obviously, you know, at the moment we are, there's a lot of protests, there's a lot of stuff going on in society. That's another example of inequality that we touched on earlier. Do you see that in terms of Build Back Better? Do you see that as being part of what we need to change in the future? I mean, Robin, you work with young people. Is that something you want to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, the answer is yes, 100%. I think just before this panel, I read a Schools Week piece around how 98% of leaders who run multi-academy trusts, kind of big trusts that run over kind of 15 or plus schools, 98% of those leaders come from a white British background. And I think that is a real shock, considering schools educate communities of all races, all backgrounds, all classes. And I think if we are going to reimagine what society looks like, we should consider who are running those positions of power. I mean, there is no doubt that at the moment, positions of power are largely operated by those who are white, middle class, male, and probably from the Southeast and London. So if we were to genuinely reimagine what society looks like, we should probably think about it in terms of geographically differently, but also involving a wider range of people from currently kind of marginalized communities. And if we don't crack that leadership piece at the top, I don't know how we then see genuine kind of policy change kind of filter down onto the front line. So for me, it absolutely has to be representative leadership at the top for us to see any kind of meaningful kind of social change moving forward.
Brilliant, thank you. Would anyone else like to add anything to that? Brilliant. Well, we have overrun by 5 minutes. So, Julia, do you want to say something?
I thought somebody else wanted to say something. Sorry.
Oh no, no worries. It's all the fun of Zoom. So yeah, I appreciate we didn't quite get to everyone's questions. There were a lot of questions and a lot of chat on YouTube. So I'm glad that everyone was having a good time watching. Thank you so much to everyone for coming along, and thank you to our panelists for your expertise today and for giving up your lunch break to come and talk to everyone. Really appreciate that. And we will be organising some more events in the not too distant future. Thank you very much.